will be the chair of this session. And we have got 3 presenters lined up. So first to go will be Valence, with this topic, Navigating Epistemic Violence in Post-Genocide Rwanda, a case study of faith, forgiveness, and family among Jehovah's Witnesses. And then we have Dixon Igwe with Is It a Criminal Label Against Youths and Inclusive Government? Drug Offense as a Reason for Political Alienation of Youths in Ado Ekiti LGA. And the last one from Oluwafemi Oni, The Development of Indigenous Education Policy as the Panacea for Africa's Underdevelopment, the Nigerian Case Study. So we will give this floor to Valence, and this is what we will do. I was trying to see, it doesn't seem like I don't see the other presenters yet. So Valence, I'll give you 20 minutes for a presentation, and then we will have 10 minutes for question and answer after that. All right, are you ready to go, Valence?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. So I'll be sharing my screen. Hopefully it is going to be showed in the room, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I hope you can see my screen.
Is he sharing the screen or
yes.
you're doing okay?
You see my screen?
Yes.
Great. So my name is Valence Nhurikinga, and thank you for introducing me, Stella. And I'm honored to present today on navigating epistemic violence in post-genocide Rwanda, a case study of faith, forgiveness, and family among Jehovah's Witnesses. Rwanda, often referred to as the land of the thousand hells, is also known for the tragic 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. And the genocide, as you may know, it lasted for 100 days. And the 100-day period, during that time, an estimated 1 million people were killed, with 75% of Tutsi population murdered. The genocide was characterized by mass killings, often committed by neighbors, fellow churchgoers, and even family members. And the result was that 120,000 people were tried for genocide crimes. So, as my subject is also about epistemic, genocide as epistemic violence. So epistemic violence refers to the marginalization and oppression of certain groups by creating and maintaining power structures that exclude alternative ways of knowing and being. So in the case of Rwanda, this type of violence contributed to the discrimination and marginalization that led to the most atrocity that the human being has known in Rwanda, the genocide. And according to the Gregory Stanton, genocide progressed through 10 stages, including classification, symbolization, and extermination. In Rwanda, these stages were marked by the exclusion and devaluation of certain groups, which laid the ground for the genocide. So in the aftermath of the genocide, Rwanda has focused on recovery, reconciliation, and reconstruction. And our study examines these processes within Jehovah's Witnesses community, exploring how faith, forgiveness, and family have played a role in healing. And my presentation is based on findings from the nationwide study, Jehovah's Witnesses during and after genocide against Tutsi. Sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. This technology is disturbing somehow. Oh, okay. Okay, here we go. So our study utilized a nationwide online survey with a sample size of 13,590 participants, and all participants were baptized Jehovah's Witnesses aged 18 and older. This quantitative cross-sectional study is the first of its kind to investigate the attitude and experiences of Jehovah's Witnesses in post-genocide. We faced several challenges in ensuring access equity, particularly in rural areas where education, poverty, digital literacy, and internet connectivity posed significant barriers. And note that over 70% of the Rwandan population live in rural area, and you can imagine how it was challenging to conduct an online survey in the country where internet connectivity is problematic in the rural area. So access to equity was addressed by providing Wi-Fi hotspot and loan tablet, especially in poorer and more rural congregations. Additionally, assistance to read and navigate the electronic survey, similar to practice used by Rwandan researchers and the government during election in Rwanda, was utilized by 44% of respondents, resulting in a more complete and historical record of the survey. Our sample was representative of the general population, as you can see on this sample size, with a similar distribution of respondents across rural and urban areas and all provinces. So the sample had a similar gender and age proportion to the general population. And our sample had a similar gender and age proportion to general population, as I said. But 2/3 of our respondents had first-hand experience of the genocide, either as adults or children in Rwanda during 1994. The remaining third had second-hand knowledge, either as returnees or as individuals born after the genocide. So our study focused on 4 main themes. The first one was religious factors. The second is pro-social and psychological factors, and genocide and trauma. And the fourth is family and communication. And these themes helped us understand the complex dynamics within the Jehovah's Witnesses communities. So today we will be exploring how the faith community of Jehovah's Witnesses is faring in post-genocide Rwanda by examining 3 factors: recovery, which includes the centrality of genocide in their thought, post-traumatic stress, and personal growth. We'll be also examining reconstruction, which involves rebuilding their religious and social identities in the aftermath of the genocide. Third, we'll be examining reconciliation, which focuses on forgiveness, helping behavior, and the improvement of relationship within the community. So recovery involves addressing the centrality of genocide in people's lives, post-traumatic stress symptoms, and post-traumatic growth. And many respondents reported that the genocide significantly affected their worldview and personal lives. With regard to centrality of genocide, so the questions explored how central the genocide is to respondents' worldview and personal life and family life. And a high number of prefer not to answer responses indicated some discomfort, particularly regarding family-related questions. Despite this, 60% reported that the genocide significantly affects how they think and feel about the world, and nearly 50% often think about its impact on their lives. We also asked the question, how often do you think about the genocide against the Tutsi? And about 36% of respondents think about the genocide frequently or persistently, while about 20% think of genocide rarely or never. However, young adults tend to think about genocide less often than older and middle-aged adults. So the question was not specific to genocide with regard to PTG, to post-traumatic growth, but we inquired the following. We inquired if the genocide against the Tutsi has affected the way someone think and feel about the world. We also inquired if the genocide, if someone often think about the effect the genocide against the Tutsi has on his or her life. We also inquired how someone feels that the genocide against the Tutsi is a central part of his family life story. The survey measured perceived post-traumatic growth. The mean score for the 4 subscale were only slightly higher for those who experienced the genocide, regardless of age and background. The witnesses perceived personal growth from traumatic experience, and spiritual change was slightly higher than the other subscale. With regard to reconstruction, so reconstruction focuses on rebuilding religious and social identities. Our findings show that Jehovah's Witnesses have a strong religious identity, which may help moderate the impact of genocide on their social identity. And these are the dynamics of the congregations of Jehovah's Witnesses in Rwanda. It is now made up with genocide, with the post-genocide generation, with returnees, with former perpetrators, with bystanders, with victims and targeted, and helpers also. And this was, it's a composition of the population we were studying. So, and now the question we have to ask ourselves, how can congregations integrate those with diverse and conflictual background? So do individuals define themselves by single genocide laws? Or how can a broad understanding of role situation help relationships? So respondents identified with multiple roles during the genocide, such as helpers, victims, and bystanders. And this complexity highlights the diverse experiences within the community and the need for inclusive reconciliation effort. In combined category, this is the table showing the combined category and multiple and complex of those combined categories. Those who faced harm, whether targeted or not, often acted as helpers. And over 40% of those imprisoned for genocide acts also refused to harm or betray those targeted. And 1/3 of them indicated that they helped others in danger. So multiple roles were played during genocide. And a widely used measure of social organization involves a 7-point scale where respondents indicate their agreement with the statement, I identify with a given organization, and over 98% of Jehovah's Witnesses agreed with this statement, with more than 80% selecting strongly agree. And additional items such as how I see myself, glad to be, and committed further demonstrate a strong religious identity within the community of Jehovah's Witnesses. And this strong identification may provide a sense of stability and support in their post-genocide lives. So the survey asked what originally attracted you to Jehovah's Witnesses and what attracted you now to remain in the religion. So respondents could select 3 out of 11 items, and the main attraction to the religion were the logic of teachings, the desire to learn more about the Bible, being closer to God, and having hope for the future. And these factors continue to attract and retain members in the community of Jehovah's Witnesses. So this measure of community resilience was applied to the congregation as a religious community. The findings reveal a strong sense of support within the congregation, and the congregation is viewed as a significant source of support during difficult times, including relationships that provide help during those times and perceived organizational support in the event of disasters or other difficulties. So with regard to reconciliation, first of all, reconciliation involves forgiveness, helping behaviors, and changing the relationships. Our study found that many respondents have experienced positive changes in their relationship since becoming Jehovah's Witnesses, with a strong disposition towards forgiveness. Now let's discuss the trait of forgiveness, starting with the positive items. Our study measured respondents' disposition to forgive interpersonal transgression. The result shows that most respondents have a strong tendency to forgive. They generally avoid holding grudges and are less likely to harbor resentment. This positive trait of forgiveness is crucial in the context of post-genocide Rwanda, as it facilitates healing and reconciliation within the community. On the other hand, when you look at the negative items related to trait of forgiveness, we see a more nuanced picture. About 1/3 of respondents still feel bitter about certain relationships. Despite this, the majority managed to avoid grudges, resentment, and unforgiveness. And this indicates that while there is a significant progress in fostering forgiveness, there are still challenges to be addressed in overcoming lingering bitterness and resentment. During the genocide, with regard to giving and receiving help from Jehovah's Witnesses, almost 20% of respondents could have been killed while giving help, and another 20% were hidden on others' property. Over 1/3 gave or received material help, and almost half received the spiritual encouragement. We asked the question, in the past year, did you or your family receive or give help from or to Jehovah's Witnesses? And respondents reported receiving more spiritual and emotional help than they gave. While respondents reported receiving more spiritual and emotional help than they gave, they have reported to give more instrumental support than they received. And these dynamics reflect the supportive nature of the community of Jehovah's Witnesses. And as you can see on this graph, new baptized members receive slightly more help than they give. But as they spend more time in the community, they engage in more helping behavior. And this trend highlights the growing involvement and support within the community over time. Finally, what is the perceptional change of relationships since becoming one of Jehovah's Witnesses? Over 85% of our respondents indicated that their relationships have improved since becoming Jehovah's Witnesses, especially with family. And in conflicted relationships, over 90% reported a positive change, with 50% indicating significant improvement. And in conclusion, what can we say? Our study highlighted the resilience and recovery of Jehovah's Witnesses community in post-genocide Rwanda. Some 30 years after genocide against the Tutsi, they have made significant stride in healing and rebuilding their lives through faith, forgiveness, and family, effectively managing recovery, reconstruction, and reconciliation. Thank you for your attention. And now I'm very happy to take any questions from you that you may have. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Valence, so much for your presentation. Well, it was enlightening. I remember when the genocide happened, I was, yeah, if I tell you my age, then you'll be able to guess how old I am now, right? Anyway, I think I was in my first year of 1994. I was in my first year of high school. So I'm a Zimbabwean, so we had it on the news, you know, and it is, but because you are like several miles away, this is something that is kind of like divorced from you, and you're not really like, oh yeah, people are being killed there, and it's not something that you can really identify with. But I've certainly learned a lot of that, a lot of information from you. The genocide happened in 1994, 400 days, and millions of people were killed. And your research was focused on the recovery, reconstruction, and reconciliation after the genocide. And two major things that I just found interesting was that the older and middle-aged population were more likely to think about the genocide than the younger generation, and that your respondents, the Jehovah's Witnesses, had reported that their sense of identity was very instrumental in moderating the effects of genocide, and that they felt that being a Jehovah's Witness offered them support and stability. All right, so thank you so much for your study. Questions from the floor? We're open to questions from the floor. Which means one of two things: your presentation was very, very good, or people understood nothing. So, so I have one question while we are waiting for other people to come up with a question. I think Donna seems to be indicating that she has a question. Is that an indication that you want to ask a question? Anyway, so my question is on your responses on the responder bias. I'm just wondering how, or if you ever considered responder bias and how you dealt with that. For instance, there are some, looking at some of your questions, right? There are some things that people might consider like socially unacceptable, so they will answer in a certain way. Like, for example, asking someone, are you forgiving, right? Or how forgiving are you? So I'm just curious if that is something that you considered in your research, the responder bias, and how you dealt with that. Because like, if I was asked how forgiving am I, and I'm thinking, if I say I'm not a forgiving person, that might put me in a bad light socially, I might tend to respond another way.
Do you want me to respond now, or I can wait for some other questions maybe?
Any other questions? Donna Cooper, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was curious about the getting access for so many people to take this survey in rural Rwanda. That was impressive.
Okay, if you have a question, please just go ahead, unmute and ask your question. All right, Valence, I think, well, maybe people are thinking of questions. You may answer the two, you may respond to the two that have come in so far.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you both for your very nice question. Maybe starting to the last one, getting access in rural area and having, I may say, a bombastic or a huge sample size it's really very impressive. And many people who come to know this, that our study was online survey and was conducted in a developing land. It doesn't place people. However, we found with my team of researchers, we found that Jehovah's Witnesses are I may say they are advanced. That's what we found. They usually use electronic devices in their meetings, in their weekly meetings, in their services. So that was an advantage. Secondly, as I said, we were able to provide hundreds of tablets to different congregations in remote and rural areas where the internet connectivity or access to devices was an issue. But also we provided hundreds of Wi-Fi hotspot, the data hubs that were used to connect those devices to internet. And we were able to train more than 600 people around the country to provide technical assistance to those who may not be able, for the illiterate people who may not be able to manipulate electronic devices. So that's the way we were able to capture such huge data across the country, even though it was within a challenging situation. But we have realized that it is possible. Doing a study also in African context where people do not have access to internet, it's really possible. So with regard to your question about forgiveness, I hope that's, are you fine, Donna? So with regard to forgiveness, so you are saying, were you asking people, do you forgive?
No, I'm asking, like, did you consider responder bias and how people are more likely to respond to certain questions if they may view them, for example, in a way that responding in a certain way may be viewed socially unacceptable? So I gave the question of forgiveness as an example. Like, if you ask somebody, like, how forgiving are you, or do you willingly forgive? And they'll say, if I tell people, if I respond that I'm not very forgiving, people might look at me in a certain way. So I was just asking, like, did you consider responder bias when you were doing, and how you counteracted that in your analysis?
Yeah, sure. We considered that because we knew that there are some element that may be socially unacceptable, but we had some anti-bias measures. Like our survey was anonymous. Our survey was anonymous, but also we had socially desirable response bias set. And on the list we have the do not answer or prefer not to answer. So all those options were set for people to know that if I provide the accurate information about myself, I'm secure. Nothing will happen. And we explained to them that this is a scientific study. that is going to help to understand the community of Jehovah's Witnesses. So we couldn't have any problem, but we also, when we were doing analysis, we had to calculate the that socially unacceptable responses, and we removed some of them. So and we think that using those measures was very effective for our study.
Okay. All right, thank you so much. Any other questions?
Yes. Can you hear me from here?
Can you hear? No, I don't think you can.
So can you ask the question from?
Okay, yeah.
Such a political issue, was it difficult to get extract data from people? You know,
Okay.
it's very political, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So how difficult was it, or how was he able to navigate the issue of getting people to, you know, answer such a question?
Okay.
Without having issue the government or religious authorities.
Okay. All right. So his question is that this is a heavily political subject, right? So his question is, how were you able to navigate, or how were you able to gather so much information without political interference from either politicians or the government or religious entities coming in to like hinder you in your data collection?
Well, thank you so much. We this study, you know, as genocide, it's sensitive. It's a sensitive subject. However, we went through approval processes in Rwanda. So we've got the Rwanda National Ethics Board reviewing our proposal or the protocols, including our survey, and they gave us approval, the Rwanda National Ethics Committee. And we also got an approval from the Ministry of Unity, National Unity and Civic Engagement in Rwanda. So they gave us approval letter because they have even encouraged, they are encouraging religious entity to undertake those kind of surveys so that they can understand how members of their religion have did behaved during genocide. So we got a buy-in of both the government and the technical people who are in charge of reviewing protocols in Rwanda. So that's what happened for our case. But we really didn't see any resistance from both sides, whether the government or the RNEC, Rwanda National Ethics Committee. However, also, I may say that Jehovah's Witnesses follow a political doctrine which the government is aware of. So they couldn't just come and say, you are going to, for example, disseminate things that may be perceived as political, while they know Jehovah's Witnesses' political stance.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I can't see participant in the room, but you will continue to moderate and play a bridge role between us.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. Any other questions? If we have no other questions, we will move on to the other speakers if they are online. I don't see them online. Dixon Obanaya Igwe and Oluwafemi Olutanji Oni, are you?
I also thank you so much for your attention. It was great to be with you.
All right, it looks like the other two presenters may not be available. So for this session, we will stop here, but feel free to To log into session A, the presentations are still going on. And if you want to come back to we have the second session starting at 11:30. So feel free to join us for any of those. Thank you so much. Hopefully, we'll see you again later.
And our first presenter is Margie Buckner from Missouri State University. And she's speaking on mistaken messaging, what the doctors got wrong about HIV-2 in West Africa. Go ahead, Margie.
So thank you. It's good to be back with MAAAS, and I especially appreciate being able to present virtually. And I apologize in advance. I'm going to pack a lot of information into this presentation. Maybe too much, but I'll be happy to answer questions afterwards. Next slide, please. So many of you probably don't know the difference between HIV-2 and HIV-1. HIV-2 was identified in the late 1980s. The epicenter is in Guinea-Bissau, which I don't have to explain. You're all Africanists, so you know where Guinea-Bissau is. That's wonderful. It's also found a little bit in Senegal and the Gambia, in Portuguese-speaking areas because of the Portuguese connection, like Brazil and Mozambique and Angola, and Portugal, of course, and among some immigrants in the US. But of all HIV, HIV-2 is tiny. Only 1% of HIV infections in the world are HIV-2. It is similar to HIV-1 in that it crossed over from SIV, although from a different monkey. It leads to AIDS, so you can die of AIDS. And at least originally, it was thought that HIV-2 seems to be transmitted in the same way as HIV-1. And that's highlighted because that's the point I'm going to be contesting. It's different from HIV-1 in that it is rarely, if ever, transmitted from mother to child. It affects older age groups, like over 40 is hit much harder than the younger ones. There's a lighter viral load than HIV-1, and so it takes a longer time for AIDS to develop. Although once AIDS does kick in, you can die of it. Next slide, please. So this is HIV-2 research in Cayo, Guinea-Bissau. Began in the late 1980s when a French doctor who was based in, I can't show you, Ziguinchor up in southern Senegal, he noticed that over a third of the workers in Ziguinchor were HIV-2 positive. Thank you. And then he also noticed that over a third of the sex workers in Ziguinchor, sorry, that's misspelled, were from the Cayo sector. And Cayo sector is down kind of on the northwest coast. There you go. And Cayo itself, the village, is the little tiny button inside of the Cayo sector. So a significant number of sex workers who were seropositive, who worked in Ziguinchor, came from this tiny little village in northwest Guinea-Bissau. And so the doctor who worked there asked for the Medical Research Council, which is a UK, it's a British organization, but it has a large base in the Gambia. He asked them for a grant to study what's going on in Cayo. Next slide, please. So welcome to Cayo. These are just a few pictures. I spent 2 years there, and then I've been going back almost every year, or I had been going back almost every year. They live on rice, mangrove rice. There's lots of dancing, there's lots of work, there's lots of everything there. It's a very vibrant place. So I just wanted to give you some visual images. So next slide, please. So phase 1, this is the initial study, was 1989 to 1991. And two doctors and several assistants took samples, blood samples of 2,270 people there. And it turned out that 8.3% of the adult population tested positive for HIV-2, which is really humongous for a tiny little village in the general population. At one point, it was up to even 9%. So this is really big. If almost 10% of the population were HIV-1, we'd be hearing about it. Also, the highest prevalence among people was among people over 40 years old. And you can see that on the right, the lower right, there's 17.2%, 15. So the over 40s are the ones where it's hit the hardest. Thank you. Next slide, please. So phase 2, that's where I kicked in. They hired a medical anthropologist. That was me. And my aim was to investigate the role of sex workers in spreading the virus, along with other possible vectors. And so what I did is I continued the annual census. I had 8 wonderful assistants, and they're smiling faces. We did a lot of surveys, we did life histories, we did illness histories, we did family trees. I did a lot of participant observation, and we did a lot of maps. So just general anthropological research there. Next slide, please. So this is a sample of the census page. Now there are over 8,000 people in this census who live in Cayo, which is, well, I'll call it the village of Cayo. And there are over 50 fields in the census. So the amount of work put into this was absolutely amazing. So we have, including the birthplace, the year of birth, and all the info on the mother, the father, the spouse, and it goes on and on and on and on and on. Next slide, please. I also did a lot of work with the sex workers. And again, here are a couple of visuals. These are ladies down in Bissau. We did interviews. I had 3 assistants who were actually more or less born into sex worker families, and they were extremely comfortable working with them and vice versa. They did most of the interviews, although I did several myself. My language wasn't good enough until the end of my stay to be able to do them in Manjaco. We also consulted the records from Ziegenshore. We did observation from a very discrete distance to kind of gauge how many clients each woman was receiving, was hosting, etc. We did family trees, casual conversations, and visits with women's families, especially for triangulation. And I actually published an article on that, and I'd be happy to send it to you if anyone's interested. It was in a book that probably no one's ever heard of. So we did lots of research. Actually, most of my research was based on sex workers. Next slide, please. So these are just 2 really quick slides to show that the average age of the prostitutes was also over 40, okay? So this is also very different than the urban kind of prostitution that you find in the big cities and that you see in other countries. So these are older women, most of them, and they were practicing prostitutes up in their 60s. Next slide, please. I think I presented all this at MAAAS once, years ago. So this is just to show the difference in age. So the sex workers in the Gambia, their average age versus in Dakar and Ziguinchor, and then in Guinea-Bissau. So a much older age group in Guinea-Bissau. Thank you. Next slide, please. So my first finding was that of all of the HIV-2 positive women, a third of them, well, 30% had worked or were working as sex workers. Okay, so that was my #1 finding, 30%, that's what they wanted to know. Next slide, please. And then I started a new database, and this is called a couples database. I called it a couple, I invented it, where each row does not represent a person, it represents a couple. So I was able to, I have 3,500 couples, and the ones in yellow, for example, it shows you, and I took the names off so you can't see any names here. So for example, the yellow show the same woman, but her different spouses. Again, with all the information about where they were born and all this, et cetera, whether she had worked as a sex worker, et cetera, including information on children and including what order she had married that man and what order she had children with him. So I was going to say one more thing. Yeah, the information on this was gathered in a non-invasive way. I never went up and asked, who have you had sex with? Okay, or whatever. I went by publicly available information, who had lived or was living with whom, who had married or was married with whom, and whom had children with whom, who were the father and the mother of the children. So that's where I got this information. And I should also say that men, that in Manjaco, in Cayo, the men do practice polygyny. They have several wives at one time. The women, however, practice serial androgyny. In other words, they have 3 or 4 men, different husbands in their life, even though they're not all at the same time. So, okay, next slide, please. And from that giant couples database, this is where I got this information. So the discordance among couples. So what this slide shows you is that if both couples, the wife and the husband are HIV negative, okay, that's 83% of the couples were negative, okay? And 3% were positive. So the husband and the wife, thank you. Whoever's doing the arrow, thank you, is positive. Now the red ones are showing discordance, where the wife, or where one of the wife is seropositive and the man seronegative, or the wife is seronegative and the husband is seropositive. And so what this shows is that in the 15% of cases where one of the partners is seropositive, only 3% are both of them positive. So there are a lot of couples where the man is positive, the woman negative, or vice versa. And that to me was astounding. This is not what we expected to find. Next slide, please. This is just a small example of the kind of detailed information that I had. This is one HIV positive man, and I knew him very personally. He died. And each C represents a child that he had with one of his wives. Not all of these wives were at the same time. Some divorced, some whatever. Okay. And 2 of them were seropositive wives. All of the other wives with whom he was having children during these years were seronegative. So this kind of, and I have several like this, although this is the one with the most wives. So this shows that the HIV-2 was not being transmitted from that husband to those wives, or from the husband to the wives. Thank you. Next slide, please. And again, I did many details of these things. So this is like a cluster. I guess you could call it a sexual relations cluster. Now, the whites mean we do not know whether they were seropositive or negative. The butterfly means a prostitute, a sex worker. And so you can see where the sex workers were kind of involved at one time or another with seropositive people and also with seronegative people. But look at all the seronegatives. So yeah, I have another one just like this. So go to the next slide, please, because we're already running out of time. And the next slide. Yeah, so the next slide is basically the same thing. It just shows that there was not a pattern of sexual transmission. Yeah, so these are my big conclusions. Sexual transmission is not a major factor in the spread of HIV-2, and sex workers are not a major factor in the spread of HIV-2 in Cayo. Now, the sequel is that my supervisors were horrified, and they said I could not publish this information, that the women lied to me, that I must have done my research wrong, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide, please. So, but since then, research has caught up with me. HIV peaked in the 1990s and has continued to decline since then. Actually, the title of a 2006 article was Divergent Epidemic Trends of HIV-1 and HIV-2. In 2013, they're admitting no data exists on HIV-2 transmission and that HIV-2 is declining due to inefficient heterosexual transmission. In other words, they're agreeing with me, finally. And just last year, Baranda and Santos, Baranda is also a historical medical anthropologist, did immense research into the archives in Portugal and found amazing information about how during the war for independence in Guinea-Bissau, which from the early 60s to 1974, the Portuguese were using health campaigns and vaccines to win the hearts and minds of the locals. In other words, they were trying to show we can help you medically, so don't fight for your independence. And he showed how the number of vaccination campaigns skyrocketed during that time. And especially he looked at how many needles they were using. So this is the one quote that I chose. The anti-TB program aimed to immunize the whole population, estimated at 500,000, with 4,000 needles. So, and he's dug into this, and I can give you all these references if you like. So he's showing that, or his hypothesis is that without this these vaccination campaigns, that HIV-2 would not have become an epidemic and endemic in Guinea-Bissau. And that is what started the epidemic and spread the epidemic far more than sexual transmission. And so the people who were vaccinated, older population, including the sex workers, older population, and very few young ones are infected along the way. Some are. Sexual transmission does occur, but not nearly to the degree as it does for HIV-1. Next slide, please. So no harm done. There were gazillions of educational campaigns, including myself. I remember holding meetings with villagers telling them, safe sex, sex can kill you. You can catch this dreaded disease if you have sex with your husband. And even in Carnival in Bissau, there's a huge carnival there. If you're ever there during carnival time in February, it's fabulous. There, the educational campaigns, use condoms, use condoms, use condoms. Now, this isn't a place where people want kids. They don't want condoms, they want kids. And I remember telling my assistants in secrecy, because I knew who were seropositive and who wasn't, please be careful with your wife because I don't want you to infect her. I felt sick later when I found out that was totally false. Okay, next slide, please. And stigmatization and shame. Okay, this is happening at the same time that other areas of Africa, HIV-1 was raging, and stigmatization. This was in the time when Uganda, especially, and Kenya, and where people were afraid of HIV-1 and whole families were ostracized, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we were teaching them in West Africa that the same thing is happening here, okay, which was not true. And there were 3 different policies. In Senegal, they were afraid of stigmatization, so they would not reveal the HIV status if someone tested positive. In the Gambia, they had to reveal. It's just amazing how these policies develop. They had to tell someone, they would search out the family and tell them that so-and-so is HIV positive to stop the spread. And in Guinea-Bissau, if you asked, you could find out. Now, another point that was brought up by Nancy Rose Hunt,
1 minute.
thank you, was that shame has long been a part of official discourse about STDs. In the Congo was where she talked about it, but I heard the same, you can feel the same thing. If you're talking about a disease that is spread by sexual transmission, then people are afraid to say, oh yeah, I have it, or be recognized, or et cetera, et cetera. So the idea of the spread of stigmatization and shame was, yeah, for me, very harmful. Okay, and the last slide, I believe. Next slide. Thank you. There's 5 of them, so you're gonna have to click as we go. So first of all, these public health campaigns, they were trying to help, but they were actually doing harm. It was unintentional, the harm, and the mistaken messaging was unintentional, and the vaccination campaigns probably did save lives, or very likely saved lives. It would be good, however, if people would seek evidence for health policies before enacting those policies. Although when you're hard up against an epidemic, you try and do what you can. The misunderstanding about the evolution of HIV-2 continues to this day. Next one, there's only 2 more. Caution, and this is from Veranda and Santos. Caution is thus essential when using the one-size-fits-all model for viral emergencies. Now, what they say is that because people automatically assume that HIV-2 also spread the same way as HIV-1, that the real causes were not uncovered, and that more could have been understood about the virus and the spread of the virus, and that knowledge could be used in other epidemics and other viruses as they develop and spread. So that opportunity was missed because people jumped on the HIV-1 model, one-size-fits-all model. And my last question is, what if I had been allowed to publish my results in the mid-1990s? Would that have made any difference? I'm not sure. Okay, so that's all, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
The 19th century saw the rise of comparative anatomy and ethnography as important interrelated sciences, so especially with regard to African examples. I'm going to give you an account of one of these. One of the most interesting European efforts to merge show business and ethnographic science took place at Dr. Kahn's celebrated anatomical museum near Piccadilly Circus in London in December of 1854. Joseph Kahn, allegedly a German doctor of medicine, had made a profitable business of exhibiting wax models of anatomical wonders at various centers of learning on the continent before moving to London to cater to Victorian curiosity about the human body. His museum contained hundreds of natural and artificial preparations illustrating such physiological phenomena as the formation of the human embryo seen through a microscope, the development of the fetus, the process of deglutition, the anatomy of the skeleton, muscles, arteries, veins, and nerves, the development of the face and genital parts, the deformation of various bodily parts, including a special display on the dreadful effects of tight lacing, and the occurrence of monstrosities and other extraordinary aberrations. For medical gentlemen, that is, anyone interested in exploring these mysteries further, there was also an obstetrical room where closer attention was given to sexual organs in childbirth, and a pathological room where venereal disease was illustrated in all its ulcerous varieties. Among the more memorable sites here were preparations showing gangrene and mortification of the scrotum, elephantiasis of the female sexual parts, the result of onanism, and the figure of a man who had his penis torn off by a horse, rendering the constant wearing of a small silver tube necessary for the passage of urine. Needless to say, this was sex education of a very engaging kind, lurid but illuminating, serious but slightly kinky. Separate hours had to be established for ladies who wanted to see these marvels. To top it all off, Dr. Kahn made himself available in an adjoining office to anyone who needed professional advice or treatment for venereal disease. And as a sideline, he sold replicas of his most popular wax models. Dr. Kahn's contribution to ethnological science took the form of a gallery of all nations, consisting of a series of figures representing the different varieties of the human race and arranged with due regard to geographical position and mental development. Explanations are given every hour, pointing out the peculiarities of each race and embellished with anecdotes of their manners and customs. The 1853 catalog of the museum stated that here will be found in one view the graceful Circassian, the angular Copt, the erect European, and the ungainly and ill-poised Ethiopian, the agile Arab contrasted with the languid and effeminate Hindu, a gigantic Patagonian in juxtaposition with a squat and stolid Laplander, and the keen and warlike native of North America, side by side with the immovable and pacific Chinese. The accompanying lectures were given by a Dr. George Sexton, FRGS and FES, who at other times had been employed by Dr. Kahn to speak authoritatively on such topics as food, air, tobacco, lactic acid, eyesight, brain disease, and the mutiny in India. Ethnological expertise must have come easy to so versatile an expert. On the 27th of December, 1854, an astonishing new anatomical attraction was advertised in London's Morning Herald. Quote, "Nyam-nyams, or the tailed family, man, woman, and child from Central Africa, are now exhibited for the first time in Europe at Dr. Kahn's museum," unquote. The ad may have led some readers to expect that these curious creatures could be seen in the flesh, but anyone entering the museum would have discovered that the Nyam-Nyams were only 3 more waxen figures in the Gallery of Nations. However, nobody could deny that these Africans were fundamentally different from all the other folks on display. For each of the 3, Mama, Papa, and Baby Nyam-Nyam sported what Dr. Sexton sententiously described as a caudal appendage, called in common or vulgar language, a tail. The belief in people with tails had had a rather long history, stretching back at least as far as Ptolemy, 2nd century AD, who maintained that in his time they lived on certain islands. Marco Polo, 12th century, claimed that there had been such people inhabiting the kingdom of Lambri in the vicinity of Sumatra, and later travelers reported finding them in Egypt, Tripoli, Borneo, Formosa, and the Philippine Islands. Linnaeus, in fact, had placed some credence in the 17th century account of a Swedish sailor telling of a race of cannibals with tails like those of cats living on one of the Nicobar Islands in the Gulf of Bengal. In most of these stories, the people endowed with caudal appendages were said to be black, but there was at least one example cited of a teacher of mathematics in 18th century Scotland whose tail, about half a foot long, which he carefully concealed during his life, was discovered after his death. An enthusiastic advocate of the theoretical possibility of an elongation of the rump bone was James Burnet, later known as Lord Monboddo, who wrote of tailed people in his 6-volume study on the origin and progress of language, 1773 to 1792. But his views had been immediately dismissed as eccentric, irrational, and sacrilegious. James Boswell had alluded to him as a grotesque philosopher. What revived the debate about caudal appendages in the middle of the 19th century were contemporary reports by French travelers who claimed to have seen tailed anthropophagi called Nyam-Nyams, and to have heard corroborating accounts of them from many other African peoples, as well as from slave dealers. These travelers were no ordinary tourists, but explorers sent out on official expeditions by the French government. Their reports were taken seriously by the Academy of Sciences in Paris and other explorers who had collected anecdotal evidence of the existence of tailed people in the same general vicinity, who delivered supporting papers on the subject at meetings of the Oriental Society and the Geographical Society in Paris. Within a few years, Nyam-Nyams supposedly have been sighted not only in their native land, usually said to be located somewhere in Central Africa, between the Gulf of Benin and Abyssinia, a vast expanse of uncharted territory, but also in the slave quarters of Mecca and Constantinople. By 1854, a book and a pamphlet on Nyam-Nyams had appeared, and the topic was getting a lot of play in French academic journals. The book, Duperrey's Voyage to the Land of the Nyam-Nyams, was reviewed in the London Literary Gazette and Journal of Science and Art on the 28th of October, 1854. Just a week earlier, a reputable French medical magazine had carried a circumstantial summary of new findings on the question of tailed men, prompting the British medical journal Lancet to give some attention to this interesting tale in its November issue. While Dr. Kahn may have been aware of the earlier controversy in France, he seems to have been inspired to take action only after the story had appeared in the British medical media. But then he moved very swiftly. Within a month, he had his 3 Nyam-Nyams molded and mounted and had published a pamphlet on men with tails. The pamphlet, which was sold for 6 pence at the exhibition, contained an introduction by Dr. Kahn, reprints of the articles that appeared in the Lancet and Literary Gazette, and an engraving of a group of these extraordinary beings. Dr. Sexton then weighed in with his anatomical view, which consisted of a preface applauding the continual progress of science, a long series of rhetorical questions concerning caudal appendages, and a corresponding string of pat answers bolstered by glib hypotheses about the proliferation of lower vertebral bones. Quote, "Yet what, after all, is there remarkable in men with tails? What law of nature does it violate? What axiom in natural science is it in opposition to? What established principles of anatomy does it overthrow? We answer none. A tail is simply an elongation of the vertebral column. What is the difference in these parts between those animals with tails and those destitute of that appendage? Simply this, that the coccygeal vertebrae are more numerous. What is therefore to prevent the existence of additional vertebrae or two in some of the races of man? Nothing. The evidence Sexton supplied to support these assertions was entirely speculative, but included mathematical theorems and an impressive chart taken from Agassiz and Gould's Comparative Physiology that gave vertebral bone counts for various animals, birds, reptiles, and fishes. The articles were printed in from the Lancet and Literary Gazette were much more cautious in coming to a firm conclusion, but they reviewed the French explorers' accounts at some length, retailing all the pertinent anatomical details that have been published in Paris up to that time. The Literary Gazette devoted more space to the matter, quoting copiously from passages in Ducuray's narrative that emphasized the animalistic appearances and cannibalistic nature of the Nyam-Nyams. An example was given of a middle-aged Nyam-Nyam slave who had been captured as a young boy and carried off to Mecca, where he had been converted to the Islamic faith. Even though he was a devout Muslim and had lived so long abroad that he had forgotten his mother tongue, he still retained a frightful appetite for human flesh, which his master sought to allay by tossing him large pieces of raw mutton from time to time. The slave himself was said to be self-conscious and genuinely worried about this strange dietary preference, but claimed that it was an instinctual penchant that he could not control, no matter how hard he tried. In other words, once a Nyam-Nyam, always a Nyam-Nyam. Eating people just came naturally to anyone with a caudal appendage. It was a genetically acquired characteristic, custom-tailored to fit a backward African tribe at the very bottom of all humanity. Dr. Kahn made the most he could out of such details. The figures he constructed to represent the Nyam-Nyams in his Gallery of Nations were not only fitted with tails, but also framed as cannibals. The description he wrote to accompany the engraving of the three marvelous beings was based entirely on Ducuray and stressed the unsavory symbolic significance of the alertness in the male Nyam-Nyam's eye, ear, and nose. The number of spectators Dr. Kahn conned with this extraordinary exhibition is not known, but the British scientific community at large, with the possible exception of Dr. Sexton, appears to have been skeptical of the whole enterprise from the outset. John Connolly, president of the English Ethnological Society, was not at all impressed with the French explorers' accounts because so many of them are based on hearsay rather than actual observation. In Connolly's view, Dr. Kahn's exhibition, based on such flimsy evidence, was at least rather premature. It was probably no more than a tall tale in wax. But most of the spectators drawn to Dr. Kahn's celebrated anatomical museum may not have been so incredulous. Indeed, they may have been predisposed to believe in any fabulous foreign tale put before them, especially if it came out of Africa. In the public mind, the humanity of Africans was still in question, and Dr. Khan, by capitalizing on the curiosity aroused by reports of tailed cannibals in Central Africa, was only pursuing this question to its logical end. Nyam-nyams may have been merely a half-baked figment of the European racial imagination, but in 1854 to 1855, the British public ate them up. Now, I did have an illustration. I don't know if you can see it. I don't know if my image.
Yeah, you can share it. There
Oh,
should be a
here's on
share
the-
button at the bottom of your screen, or you can put it down.
Okay. Well, I don't see this on the screen.
That's okay. Put it in front of your face and we can see it. There
Can
you go. Move it over towards you. There you,
Toward me?
yeah, in front of your face. There we go. Yeah, looked a little higher. A little higher. Yeah. Thank
That-
you.
That's the family.
Okay, and we're gonna, so you are out of time, so that's perfect conclusion to your presentation, Bernd. We are gonna take questions. Now, we have one question already. And then we'll take two more questions and then we'll open up to the floor, and we have about 10 minutes total. So one more question from the floor or from somebody else online. Anybody have a question? Comment, question?
Jermaine, I have a question for Bernd, if you can
Okay,
add
good.
that to the list. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Go ahead.
Oh, me?
Yeah, go ahead with your.
Oh, okay. First, thank you. Actually, I worked with the Zande in Central Africa, and the Zande are the namesake of the Nyam-nyam. They often were referred to as the Nyam-nyam. But I was wondering, you put the emphasis on the tails, whereas the name Nyam-nyam puts the emphasis on the cannibalism, because the Nyam-nyam is supposed to be nyum, 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 I'm eating meat, I'm eating flesh.
Right.
And the
Yes.
Zande actually did practice ritualistic cannibalism to some degree during warfare with people they had beaten. So, and also I'd been explained that oh, sorry, I could turn on my.
Well, we're only taking questions, Mark.
Okay. Oh,
We're only
okay.
taking.
Could it have been the other way around? Okay, that's all.
Okay, so we're stopped there with, I think the question would be why the emphasis on the tails versus the cannibalism, maybe?
Was
Okay,
there
in
was
terms of
there
dissemination.
was there any legendary about tales? of
Okay,
the people?
legendary about tails. Okay, and that's our three questions. So I'm going to go backwards here. I'm going to let Israel start with responses. The other question that we had was, beyond the colonial legacy, do you see a light at the end of the tunnel? Will anything change, or has it changed, if I'm paraphrasing correctly? And we'll start with Israel, we'll go to Margaret, and then we'll go to Bernd, and you can comment on any of the questions. Yeah. We only have about 5 minutes, so just if you want to answer, you can answer from there. They can't hear you.
Okay,
Sorry.
so,
That was just for your laptop.
so this kind of stuff.
Yeah, Margaret can.
I see lights. Yeah.
You just have to talk loud.
Okay. The question, as I said, it sounds personal because it has, if I personally see light at the end of the tunnel, which means that, well, Africa eventually integrates when it comes to air market aviation. Yes, I do see, I'm a believer of that. But I am of the opinion that the way by which we attend to this might not get us there early. You know, so as I said during my presentation, I said we need to, modify, we need to rethink, we need to make this initiative African, not just copy and paste, right? So that everyone can win. That was why I put win-win partnership. So, but as it is now, if Yamoussoukro decision is signed by all African countries, there will be some sort of inequality, some imbalance in because of the fragmentation of the economy. So countries like South Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, Egypt, even Nigeria will win more because they can boast of airlines that will go into all African countries and pick people and then just take advantage of the whole thing. But what are we saying? What are we saying about smaller countries? So these are things that we really need to look into. So my job is to just examine. I am not an economist, rather neither am I, and I'm still. This is still at a formative stage. So I'm in the first planning to further research on things. So I hope I'm going to assign.
That makes sense to me. Margaret, did you want to respond to either questions?
I haven't heard a question, and I didn't
Let's
see
see.
Israel's presentation. We weren't able to see it online, so I'm totally lost.
Oh, I didn't know you couldn't see it online because that was supposed to be on share. So his was on aviation and the intercontinental need for freedom to move, basically, and the overall timeline of the commitment to that through organizational efforts.
I'm sorry I missed it.
Yeah, but even with yours, even with HIV and the changes in terms of diagnosis and transmission issues that have arisen over time and misinformation connected with that, and burns with misinformation in terms of characterization and basically misinformation on the presentation of Africans in general. Do you have a response to seeing any light at the end of the tunnel in terms of changing those things? Like your scenario on yours, Margie, ended with the idea of what would have happened if your early research had been published. Could that have changed things?
All right.
Actually,
I couldn't hear much of the lengthy response at the end, but let me just say that Dr. Khan was capitalizing on a tradition in the 19th century of exhibiting non-Western peoples to European audiences. It wasn't only Africans who were objects of curiosity, but especially American Indians who were brought over as individuals or groups. Among the Africans in the 19th century who became notorious in this trade, in this kind of show business, was a woman who was called the Hottentot Venus, who had an unusual bodily shape, which made her an object of curiosity to Western audiences. And also other, especially South African groups. Bushmen were exhibited, and also especially Zulus. The Zulus actually had a musical in 1953 to prove very popular with the British audience. And even Charles Dickens had gone to see it. But this kind of representative show business was very common because the people were curious about other people in the world. And to see live examples of them or fictional examples of them was quite common. In fact, in the United States, you had pseudo-Africans, people who dressed up and pretended to be Africans, African Americans who performed musically in New Orleans were recruited in the summers to represent Africans by dressing in loincloths and carrying spears and looking very fierce. So this kind of tradition, an inauthentic tradition of misrepresenting Black people, was common in various parts of the world, not only in Europe, but here in America as well.
Okay, thank you. We actually have for attending this panel discussion. Okay, so this roundtable is a discussion about
the Pan-African spirit being the cure for disinformation, miseducation, and epistemic violence in Africa. The discussants here are in the order of sitting on my right, Korede Ajebona, who is a PhD student in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Kansas. He is interested in understanding how digital technologies can be designed to connect us not to just each other, but also counter misinformation. He is particularly interested in centering questions that border on digital technologies in African philosophy. Second to Korede here is Joel Munyaneza, who is a mechanical engineering student on a pre-medicine track at the University of Kansas. He is also the founder of the KU Pan-African Vanguard, an organization dedicated to sparking vital discussions on Africa's future. With a nuanced understanding of the continent's challenges, Joel addresses issues like disinformation, economic disparities, and colonial legacies, bringing a bold vision for a united Africa to every conversation. Then we also have Israel Ayobami Ogundumila, who is a PhD student in the Department of History at the University of Kansas. His research interest is in the intersection of science, technology, and society. His research also focuses on aviation history in Africa. My name is Elizabeth Chunda. I am in the Department of African and African American Studies at KU. And my research interests are on Pan-Africanism, a comparative analysis of Pan-Africanism on the African continent and in the African diaspora. So to kick off our discussion here, I will just throw our discussion to the discussants. Firstly, maybe we can elaborate on how did we get here? How did we find ourselves talking about disinformation, miseducation, and epistemic violence in Africa? If we can start with you, Korede.
Okay, thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to all everyone in the audience. My name is Korede. So basically, misinformation and disinformation is not new. That's always been around because people in the long run always spread information for wrong reasons. But the reason why we are particularly interested in having these conversations now, because we now have, within our grasp and within our reach, technologies that allow us to spread people to spread this information on a larger scale. As of 50 years ago, for you to, move information from the other side of the world to this side of the world would take weeks. Now, within 2 minutes, you can reach as far as possible. So with information being able to reach more people than ever before, we are now seeing the threat of disinformation becoming much more real for us. If you go back to us during the COVID-19, you saw how COVID-19 misinformation and disinformation was a cause, to be worried about. People were not protecting themselves. They were not willing to isolate themselves. They were not willing even to take the COVID-19 vaccine that, much work has been done, much research has been done for it to come into existence. So the basic reason why we are worried about disinformation now is because of the threat of, of the spread on a faster scale than ever before. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Korede. Joel, would you like to take it up from there?
Oh yeah, the question is, correct me if I'm wrong, how did we get here at the point where we're talking about Africa being disinformed, miseducated, and subjected to epistemic violence? So this is a question that is going to push me to the historical context. Let's go back before colonial interaction with the African. So Africa was such a continent which has major development in the human civilizations that have never been seen and are still now being studied. Let's look at the Giza Pyramid. Let's look at the Mali Empire. These are the kingdoms in Africa that showed that Africa was capable of achieving great things before the Europeans arrived there. But now we're seeing an Africa which have lost in the first industrial revolution. We don't have actual industries. It lost in the second industrial revolution, and it's going to lose in the third industrial revolution. I call it AI if we don't intervene right now. So that's where I am reaching by saying that we are misinformed, miseducated, and subjected to the epistemic violence, and we need to act now. Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
Okay, thank you. Israel.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. For me, I understand disinformation, miseducation, and epistemic violence as a deliberate intention, to control the psyche of people. So it's different from when you carry rumors. When you know that you have listened to rumors, yeah, in your mind you can decide to go with it or not. But when you are exposed to this information, it's coming to you with an intent, with a purpose, with an objective. So at any level in African history, it should be worrisome. I mean, we should be concerned about it, either at the pre-colonial period, colonial period, or even now. So it's an intention to control people. It's a tool, I would call it a tool to control a certain set of people. And it could come in different ways. It could come through formal education. We are well aware that as at the mid-20th century, the history that were taught in African classes are European history. Even up to 1960, there was a British historian, Hegel, who said Africa has no history. So I know he meant something else, and he says whatever we see now is darkness. Like Africa does not have history. Maybe in future Africa will have history. So these are strategy, and I am not making this a colonial slave master analogy. I'm also focusing on misinformation in Africa itself. So I've read books about Nigerian civil war, and you'll be surprised at the perspective of a writer from the eastern part of Nigeria will be different from the perspective of a writer from the western writer. So there are different perspectives, when it comes to history and misinformation, but all in all, it's a tool. I understand it as a tool that has a certain objective, and that is why we are discussing it now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. So this panel proposes that Pan-Africanism is the cure to disinformation, miseducation, and epistemic violence. So to begin with, what really is Pan-Africanism to each of you, and how are you proposing that as a solution? If we can start with you, Joel.
Oh yeah, thank you. Pan-Africanism is a movement which was started in 1990s that is aimed to bring every African or anyone who's interested in the well-being of Africans or the descendants of Africans to unite together, speak with one voice so that they can achieve what they want. It was as a result of realization that Africa could not reach anywhere if it doesn't unite. This had people, pioneers like Malcolm X. These are the people who initiated it, and their vision is having an Africa with one government, one military, one monetary fund, and something like that. So this is a dream which lived till today, and it's as important as it was last time. And this is a vision which led to the 54 African presidents to meet in 2013 and then discuss of what they projected as dream for them. So that brings me to the point of Africa Agenda 2063. This was a project set by the African presidents and African leaders that they can achieve something significant in 50 years. It was set in 2023 and expected to be achieved in 2060. But if I look at it, I can realize that there are some mistakes in there. So they're still realizing their dreams through a process which I call gradualism. They want to achieve everything in a gradual process. And this thing that they want to achieve is the unity of Africa. They have some pillars. Let me show you the way the gradualism is not working. They have some pillars, like African passport. They expect all the Africans to have one passport. I can ask you a question. Do you think that Africans have one passport? Because it was expected that we should have one passport by 2023. Yeah, so it was expected that in my passport, I would not have a Rwanda in my passport. I would have Africa on my passport. That would be a very strong passport, which would give me entry to any opportunity in any country. But I don't have it. So this shows that the gradualism is not working. The second vision was the continental free trade area. For you who from Nigeria, tell me, is it Dangote failing to get his things in Zambia? Dangote is failing. Why? The continental free trade area is not working. Another thing is the silencing of the guns. So you will laugh if I tell you that Africa expected to have silence of the guns by 2020. But now look at Sudan. Now look at DRC, Mali. Those are the countries where guns are not only killing people, but they're killing hope and dreams of young people and youth. So this makes them want to leave, and they end up dying in the Mediterranean Sea and anywhere, trying to come here, trying to go to the Europe, just because of this. The second thing is the African Monetary Fund. This is a project that was put in place so that Africans, if a country needs money, doesn't have to go to borrow with a very huge interest. But this did not work. They still did not have it, and they expected to have it by 2023. How many years are we far from there? It's been 2 years, I think, since then. So Sudan, now it has a GDP debt ratio of 200. That means that 200 of their GDP, 200% of their GDP is debt, is the money they borrowed. So they don't even have GDP. I don't even need to talk about Sudan GDP now, because it's in minus. If I talk in GDP, it's minus. So I will also talk about Eritrea. It's 175%. It's also in minus. So this shows you that the African countries are now dying. Yeah, there is a scholar called Albert Einstein. He said that motion is relative, the relativity theory. So if you tell me that you're moving one step and others are flying 1,000 steps a second, you're not moving. You're moving backwards, according to them. So Africa is going in a backward state right now, if I look in that perspective. This lack of the monetary fund results in a tragedy of Africa, where Western countries end up earning more money than the Africans are earning from themselves. I can give you an example. In 2024, the president of the People's Chinese Republic, he met 54 presidents of Africa, gave them 50 billion as investments, and they were all fighting for that. I need you to invest here. We are the ones who should be giving a lot of money. That's the president of the Democratic Republic of Congo. We need a lot of money. But if you go back in time, you realize that France itself is getting 500 billion US dollars, according to Africa Check. Yeah, it's a website which says that France is getting 500 billion US dollars from its intervention from Africa. So if Africa could invest in those projects and get that money, we can be rich. But due to lack of coordination, due to lack of cooperation, due to lack of a single government system, we are still lagging behind, and this is not going to work unless Africa finds itself in a position where it works with one hand, with one voice, and with one government, one monetary fund. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Joel, there. We will head down to Israel. Yes, so what really is Pan-Africanism for you in this defense that it is the cure?
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. For me, what Pan-Africanism means, I'll start from where my colleagues took it. Pan-Africanism itself is an idea to bring African people together, not just Africans in Africa, Africans all around the world. As a matter of fact, Pan-Africanism didn't start in Africa, right? So by mid-20th century, it got to Africa, and since then, it has evolved over time, right? And that led to creation of several African countries, communities. You know, we have OAU. From OAU, we now have African Union. And we now have several regional associations as well, ECOWAS, the one in East Africa, South Africa, and all of these things. And believe me, you can just, a simple Google on the internet will show you how brilliant all these Pan-Africanism projects are, right? But just like I argued in my presentation, it has still not transformed to, a reality. It has still not transformed to be a beneficial thing for Africans. So AU has been around for a while. What has it done? ECOWAS has been around for a while. What does it mean to an average African? I mean, why should an average African care about all these associations? Why should an average African care about Pan-Africanism? So for me, I think Pan-Africanism is a thing of the mind. And it should not just end on, initiatives and, conferences and organizations and all of these things. So we can count all of them around Africa. They are in existence. But for me, I think Pan-Africanism is a thing of the mind. Putting African first, right? So when you are entrusted with a position as an African to take care of African business, think of Africa first, right? Prioritize Africa, right? Make everything Pan-African. That is what I understand by Pan-Africanism. And yeah, there are several definitions that we can give to Pan-Africanism, but I'm not bothered about that. There are several, scholars who have argued around Pan-African, but I'm also not bothered about that. But I'm talking about mind. So when Africans are Pan-African by mind, then we can now have real Pan-Africanism. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. Okay, so Korede, do you want to carry on just giving a perspective of, for you, what Pan-Africanism means in this case, and how do you propose it as a solution to ending disinformation, miseducation, and epistemic violence?
Sure, thank you, Elizabeth. For me, Pan-Africanism is just a consciousness of collaborating to move Africa forward. And I don't think it's a consciousness that is unique to anybody. It could be within Africa or be outside of Africa, but as long as you are making efforts to improve the lives of the people on the continent, then I would call it Pan-African. And when we talk about Pan-Africanism as a strategy to deal with disinformation in Africa, I'm just thinking it's about the collaborative frameworks in place. We already have the African Union, we have several other small regional organizations. We have agreements across the world. So I think basically when we say Pan-Africanism as a cure to disinformation, misinformation, and epistemic violence in Africa, I'm thinking, what strategy are we putting in place across the continent to deal with the misinformation that is going on or disinformation that is going on? And how are we dealing with the sources of this disinformation? So one thing I think about is we have all these tech companies or all the social media apps we are using. Most of them are not within Africa. How are we creating the frameworks? How are we creating the collaborative means to hold them accountable? Because quite frankly, most African countries cannot by themselves hold Facebook accountable because Facebook can decide to leave Ghana, leave Nigeria. But when we come together as a continent and we collaborate with the United States government, we collaborate with the Chinese government, we are able to hold these companies accountable. That's what I think should be Pan-African in dealing with this information.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for those discussions. I will throw it to the audience to see if there's any comments right now, or if you're online and you have a comment, you can still drop it in the chat. So is there any comments or questions or reactions from the audience? Yes, please.
Can you hear me? Maybe the people.
Yes.
Okay. So this topic is really sensitive and political. Anytime you talk about you cite a topic like this, you are invoking so many things. One time president of Ghana, what did he say? I believe you all know these quotes. The independence of Africa is meaningless unless it is total liberation of the African continent. How can Africa liberate itself? Is Africa going to liberate itself, come together when there is what we call imperialism, colonialism, imperialism? Is Africa going to be able to come together? I mean, the colonial masters, are they going to be the colonial masters? Have you thought about that? All these things we are saying are very beautiful, sugar-coated words. Whether or not these things can ever work, I don't know. Maybe it's a dream. But it is great young people like you are taking a deep dive into it. There are so many things that have been proposed in Africa in the past. The last presenter, Emmanuel, said something about aviation in Africa. Some of the challenges he mentioned were colonial legacy, imperialism, this. There were 4 years ago, there was something like a West African monetary union to be called ECO. Where is the ECO? Where is it? So are you going to do the ISO? Is the French West African going to leave their safer compagnie Franco-African, the Franco-African company, leave France and come and join us? So these are really topical issues. So I just want to bring this to your attention. When you are talking about this, it's not just the talking, how about the other side too? Thank you.
Okay,
Yes.
so we'll go to Christabel. If you...
I'm just thinking of the feasibility of a one Africa. All right. In Zimbabwe, we have 19 official languages. These are just the identified. It doesn't mean these are the ones that are like officially recognized, but we have got so many, right? I won't even talk of Nigeria. I think Nigeria is about 230 languages, right? And I'm just thinking like the thing that can make Pan-Africanism a reality for me is the issue of trust, which is what I think the colonial masters were able to do. They were able to divide Africa completely. We're not even talking of other countries. In Zimbabwe, the Ndebeles and the Shonas are constantly, when we go to the polls, the Ndebeles are like, they're not going to vote because there's no Ndebele candidate, right? This tribe is like, that's not is Zulu. Mashingo is what? Karanga. The Karangas, this is a Karanga, we're not voting for this person, this other tribe. So what I'm saying is, there is no trust between African people. Because honestly, do you see a Nigerian trusting a Zimbabwean or a Zimbabwean trusting a Tanzanian to be like in control of the whole continent? Muammar Gaddafi tried it, and people are like, no. I think that's, for me, that's the foundation of it. Like, how do we build trust of one another as a people to get to the point where I think the reason why some of these bodies do not work is because we're going to have an IMF fund who's going to be in charge of it. And you're like, okay, we have an African monetary fund. Who's going to be in charge of it? Oh, it's this person. Where is he from? He's from Kenya. You want the Kenyan to be in charge of everyone's money, right? You've got other 53 countries, like, why is it not a Zimbabwean? Why is it not a Botswana? Why is it not a South African? Why is it not a Mozambican? And all those things. So I think you said it's an attitude. I think so too. It starts from the attitude, but how do we foster trust within each other as a people? Growing up, there's so many things. There's so many things we've heard about Nigerians, right? And before I came to the West and started interacting with Nigerians, I had like 0.01% trust of Nigerians because of the things that, and I started interacting with Nigerians. I'm like, these are not the stories. These are not the people that I was told about. So you can imagine, this is all, of course, stemming from the disinformation, miseducation that we have when we are in our different silos, right? So you can imagine somebody down in a rural area in Zimbabwe whose narrative of a certain country is not a very good one, and you want them to trust the person who's going to lead an African body from another country, that's going to be very challenging. There was the question of language, right? And people were like, we want to have one language. Some people were like, oh, Kiswahili, somewhere like Arabic. And people from Southern Africa were like, you're just talking of languages from up there. What about languages from down south? We want Zulu. So how do we foster the trust amongst ourselves first as Africans before we can even talk of these bodies? Because I think with that fundamental trust, these bodies, we can have millions of them and they will not achieve anything because we are not trusting the people that we are putting in those places, because we're like, he's not my tribesman, he doesn't speak my language, he's not from my background, and we won't get anywhere.
Okay, thank you. So if the panel would respond to that before we throw it again for another set of comments and questions. Yes, Joel?
Oh yeah, we have two questions. I'm gonna go with Dr. Kojo. Your question was, Africa is oppressed with the imperialism. So how do we have to see, you were telling us to think about the imperialism of Africa. How can we fight it? So Nigeria itself can never, ever, and it should not even dream of it. It should never dream of fighting off the imperialists. It's impossible. If you look at the GDP of Nigeria and the GDP of the United States of America, there was a guy who said that when they go in a bilateral cooperation, it's like having a heavyweight and a dwarf and be like, hey, you fight and you cannot reach above the belt. And I mean under the belt. So the dwarf can only reach under the belt. So Nigeria itself is very weak and unable to compete any Western country, when any Western imperialism. So the unity that I was talking about, the one which is going to bring Nigeria, Algeria, those countries bring them together. They speak with one voice. It's a single continent, the biggest market in the world, over 1.5 billion people. They can go in a bilateral relationship with the Western imperialists and tell them, now we can determine the terms that we are going to engage in a relationship with. If you don't do this, you're not selling your stuff here. They can do it. But Nigeria itself can never say anything. If you don't say it, Algerians are going to take it and they're going to smuggle it through the borders and they will end up in Nigeria. So the thing is, now Africa, the only thing, it's the ride or die, unite or die. If they don't unite, they're dying, as Kwame Nkrumah said. So that was the answer to the question. The unity of Africa is going to fight off all the imperialism. If you try to fight imperialism while we are in these individual prisons, I call them prisons, borders. You call them borders, but I call them prisons. If you try to fight imperialism within these individual prisons, it's like trying to cut a tree, but going from the top and chopping leaf by leaf. Why don't you go to the root? United first. Why don't we do it? Because we have leaders who see that their interests are going to be oppressed if Africa unites. If Africa goes in the hand of someone who knows what it wants, he's going to allocate funds enough to go and fight the corruption we have in Nigeria. It's possible to set a project with all Africa funded project, which is going to fight just the corruption in Nigeria. It will not even last for 1 month if the project is implemented by all individuals with the money put together. So Africa unity can be a cure to imperialism. That was my answer to Dr. Kojo. The second question was the language and the trust. If we unite Africa, how are we going to trust someone or put the whole Africa in his hands or her hands? So my view is that the reason why Africa, in each individual country, the corruption and the trust and the ethnic tensions, is that Africa, in the individual prisons, I call them prisons, the borders, in those individual borders, if your ethnic leader, I mean the leader is from your ethnic group, you feel like your ethnic group is in the power. Why? Because he's going to go there and support the ethnic group and give it a little of the resources that the country has. So I can give you an example of where the ethnic stuff was disemphasized and now the country is thriving. Let's take a look at Rwanda. This is a country where the ethnic tension was higher than anywhere in the world. I can say that. It was an ethnic tension where brother laws against brother and killed brother with not a gun, with a panga. So just in 1994, when the president came, Rwanda have never been the same due to the policies and the disemphasizing of the ethnicities in Rwanda. So what I'm showing you is like we can learn from the last mistakes and the last successes that we've had to cure Africa with a homegrown solution. We can take a look at Rwanda, take what Rwanda did to disemphasize the ethnicities that led to the death of 1 million people just in 1 month. I mean, in 19 days, 1 million people, and apply it to the whole of Africa. I'm telling you, if you take that solution that worked in Rwanda, get it to Nigeria, Nigerians are going to see themselves as one. But the leaders are not interested because corruption and ethnicities are already in their minds. So what I'm saying is like now it's time that Africa looks in a view that it's going to move forward. Trust is not going to be a problem as long as Africans see themselves as Africans. And trust is going to be achieved by disemphasizing our ethnicities and stop using them as ways to get in power. Thank you so much. I hope I answered the question.
Okay, it seems like Israel, you had something to add.
Yeah, I just want to add something briefly because it has a very powerful proposition. I'm just going to take it from a different perspective. Right. And in a way, I'm going to join the two questions. The question of continued imperialism, external influence, and then the problem surrounding language and trust. As a student of history, I would like to think back. How did we even, get to this? Because during my presentation, fortunately, many people were not here. I mean, plenty of us that are here now were not here. So I mentioned that Africa integrated properly before the coming of the Europeans. I mean, before slavery, before colonialism, and language wasn't a problem. The barrier wasn't a problem. Trust wasn't a problem. All we needed was, what do you have? You have gold. Bring it. I'll give you cassava. What do you have? You have yam. Bring it. I'll give you maize. And that settles it, right? This is not to say that war doesn't go up. Of course, war will happen. Definitely, that is normal. But now that the Europeans have left, the colonial government have left, several decades after, almost 60 years now, even more. I belong to the school of thought that believes that we should stop this crap. I'm sorry to use that word. I mean, we should stop blaming these what have we ourselves as Africans, what have we done to Africa, right? So I realized that where the colonial government left, the African elites, political elites, took it from there, repackaged it, remodeled it, and then they continued. They even got worse. Yeah, and that is why an average Nigerian will be bothered about average Ghanaian. I mean, it will not happen. Why should I bother about Dr. Kojo? Why should I bother about Joel? And I'm talking about an average, an everyday African. But when African political elites, when they want to get into power, when they are seeking for power, they know how to make use of ethnic division, ethnic differences to divide us, just so they can get there, and then they consume all this money, they take all this money and stuff. So it's a consequence of African political issue, and it's no longer language or trust. We actually trust ourselves. I mean, why shouldn't I trust anybody, not even just African? So, in my own opinion, I believe proper political education will solve this problem, right? Let's teach people history. And I'm not saying this because I'm an history student. Let's teach Africans history. Let's African, especially the coming generation, let them know that we were once like this, and there was no separation. There was no separation. And then political education, the right political education, will eliminate colonial borders that has continued to, divide us. And the political elites has now continued from where colonial government stopped. So if you have the right mindset towards one another, if you have if you have the right political education towards Africans, I'm sorry, issue of language or anything will not be. And then talking about Pan-Africanism, sorry to take it. Talking about Pan-Africanism, if the African political elite are actually Pan-African by heart, I mean, you fight off external influence. You put your countrymen first before you sign the thing. So when you're about to sign a decision, when you're about to take a decision, you think about the poor Africans. You think about Africans first before you sign the thing. So when IMF, as you mentioned, World Bank are saying, take this loan, take this, that, and they put so much pressure because, yeah, most of these institutions know how to put pressure on government. And they come with their pressure. All you should be thinking is that, will this mean well for my countrymen? Will this transform their life? Will this lead them out of poverty? If the answer is no, then back up. So yeah, you can be called dictator, you can be called this, you can be called, history will write your name in a good place. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Seems like Korede, you also wanted to say something?
Yeah, I really love your comment about us being introspective about our place as Africans and problems we have. To be honest, I don't really care about Western countries trying to be imperial, because that is what they can do. They're also trying to have a place for themselves. I'm more interested in what are we doing in reaction to imperialism, because even within Africa, I think there's also kind of imperialism going on too. You have bigger countries, we have smaller countries, Nigeria, South Africa, they are key players. That are shakers and movers. But we've also seen, like, in the history of Africa, big countries have also supported the smaller countries to move forward. We saw the key roles Nigeria played in South Africa, with apartheid in Congo, Liberia, Sierra Leone, to help those countries achieve their own democracy. So I think the first stage for us to fight off imperialism as such is for us to have good leadership, a vision for Africa that we want. Fine, we've had colonial divisions. The first conversation to fight imperialism is for us to talk about what we experience. There is a lot of ethnic tensions within African countries, talk of secession. I think the first stage is to have this conversation. Do we even want these countries to continue? Are we even fit enough to be, are these countries even fit enough to be countries? Where do we want to go on from here? There's too much poverty, too much wars. The governance is getting worse by the day. So the first conversation to fight imperialism is, what kind of Africa do we really want? But we cannot have that conversation without good leadership. So we are now stuck in a loop. Bad leadership, bad governance, we can't fight off imperialism. So hopefully, by some miracle, we'll have good leadership that can envision a better future.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. So I'll throw it back into the audience for comments, questions, suggestions. We'll start with Jermaine because you had your hand up.
So with the history of Canada, I think that education is probably key. And I think that a lot of countries are starting to reformat. There was a big push for Pan-Africanism right during independence, right before independence. And a lot of people they did establish more of an Afrocentric perspective, but it starts in the schools. And a lot of countries, you'll see what happened 30 years ago has been dropped off now. So for instance, Ghana has always taught a plural cultural studies in their junior secondary schools. So at least you get the treatment of people that, in terms of population, you get them represented and their cultural aspects are represented in junior high. The same, not so much with Nigeria. They have the exact same structure, and this is my field of study, so I'm saying this from 30 years of research. But they do not include African history and Nigerian history per se. They do have a little bit connected with the languages if they have language teachers. Most of the school districts don't actually have certified language teachers. And that's where their cultural information is embedded is in that part of the curriculum. So if they went to a cultural studies model, and Tanzania did do this. Tanzania did it more so than any other country when they first became independent. In fact, they partnered with Walter Rodney out of the Caribbean. That was part of the whole Pan-African movement. I really, really believe that, and even in the United States, so if you just want to go universal, if you want people to unite, they have to start from the very beginning to know about each other. And I would like to say that if you go home or when you look at what you have in your own curriculums, that's where you can motivate people to change. And Nkrumah knew that. The first thing he did was change what was developed on the university system. And then he went in nationalized the K-12 system. And Nigeria did it to some aspect in their language curriculum. But Tanzania tried to redo the whole thing. And you know what stopped Tanzania? Was the World Bank and the IMF. They put a crush on their agricultural development, and they defunded a lot of things to where they couldn't move forward on what they were doing. So it wasn't that they didn't have the right ideas, it's that they came against imperial resistance or neocolonial resistance. So I think that the things are there. I don't know how you did the corruption, but I do know, and from an educational point of view, you can only learn about people if somebody presents the information. And so that would be my quest. It has been my quest for 3 years, to get education to be more Afrocentric. Here, whether it's in the US and we're talking about Africa here, or whether it's in any Africa. And I hope you endorse that in your model.
All right, okay. Timothy, thank you, Jamie.
I think I'm very impressed with the passion of this discussion. But the question I always ask myself is there something inherent in the African that makes us follow this path that we follow? Because what we see in Africa is there is, we in the West, they refer to the African continent as a social society where people stay prefer to be in society than the individual. But when you look at what is happening, you realize that there is a lot of individualism on the African continent. So when you have someone get into public power, all they think about is first themselves, then next family, before anything else. And when they start to think about anything else, it is just because they want to maintain that power. Then they go back and think about themselves first. So it makes me ask, is there something that is inherent in the African mind that needs to be changed? Now, how will that be changed? Is it going to be, do we turn the whole of Africa into a social continent? But if you do that, you will be sure that the West will come after you, because now you have a socialist state and you are kind of, maybe the idea behind the process might be right because you want to get everybody to think the same. But the West will come and tell you, you're controlling the people, you're making them all think the same way, and that is a socialist state. So how do we, like the gentleman in the middle, sorry, I'm not very good with names, but I'll pick it up. You mentioned cutting the tree from the root. The question is, what is the root? What is the basis? Where do we start from? And when we talk about leadership, leadership is a whole different animal altogether. And because the leaders we have in Africa do not think about anything else but their pocket. When they come out to make beautiful social pronunciations like projects and everything, it's all because they want to maintain the power that you will give to them. So you would have your roads terrible. For the first 2 years, in Ghana, we have 4 years system for the president. For the first 3 years, your roads will stay terrible. Accidents will be happening, nobody will mind. But when election is about to start, then you see them coming to pour asphalt on the roads, and then you go around and say, yeah, we made roads for you, we did this, we did that, we did this. So again, how does leadership play in the context of Pan-Africanism? Because Pan-Africanism cannot be an individual desire. I'm sure there are a lot of people on the continent that are wishing that Africa could also be big, could also be, could also have like motivational projects coming from Africa. But when they talk about it, it just fizzles out. So why does it fizzle out? Is it because we are not doing well, or what?
Okay, yes, you can go ahead and respond, Grady.
Thank you so much for this. For me, there is nothing wrong with the African mind. There is nothing inherent in us that makes us bad, because we've seen Africans leave the continent and do really, really impressive stuff across the world. You know, people are working hard, they leave their homes and they do impressive. So I can't say there's anything, you know, inherently bad in us. But I think it's the system. You know, if we go back to at least early independence, we saw how development was picking up in some countries. Then problems of nation building started happening. And I mean, with a lot of external influence, leaders didn't get it right. But I don't think there's anything inherently wrong. And if you look at our kind of like recent happenings with the even more younger generation, we see the protests, police brutality, when it started in Nigeria, I think it went over to Kenya. I mean, and the leaders were kind of like saying, okay, this is new. In Nigeria, the governments were really, really scared. It was unbelievable for them. It was unimaginable that people in their thousands will walk into the streets and say, we are tired of this. So that tells us there's nothing inherently bad in it. It's the system over time, with the years of military rule, with the decay in education system, and also let's think about the brain drain too. The beautiful minds have already left. So we have the terrible politicians that have nothing to offer, you know, send their kids abroad and then they come back and pollute the system more. You see the case of Nigeria where we now have the office of the first son, office of the first daughter. You know, certain things that are happening that way. How would this happen?
Office of what?
Office of the first son.
Are you serious?
Yeah. It's so bad, like the president's son is attending cabinet meetings because nobody is willing to speak up. You know, the state capture, South Africa, Nigeria, you know, it's just a mix of a lot of things. So it's hard for us to imagine a past that was better. So we think, oh, we are inherently bad. No, it's just the system that has decayed over time until we can say, no, we don't want this. And I think over time now, young people are saying, we don't want this. And I'm believing in some 5 years, there's going to be more protests and we'll have a beautiful Africa one day.
Okay.
So basically for me, I think where it starts from is from each person. You know, saying we are tired. It's not fair. People are traveling in dinghies, rubber boats across the continent, you know, losing their lives. Until, you know, I watched the film and the person was like, why do you think they build walls? You know, they build like walls for people not to cross over. He's saying it's not for you. It's not, the wall is not saying you shouldn't come in. It's saying you should go back to where you're coming from and go fix where you're coming from. It is until each day that each of us are tired, like I'm going back to where I'm coming from to fix it. That is when Africa will get there.
Okay, thank you. Joe?
I want to just comment on Courage's speech about, it was the previous one. Yeah, you took that you don't mind Africans integrating with the West, getting knowledge from the West, and developing Africa through that way. But I disagree, because there is no way that we're going to cooperate with the West with all those minerals we have, with all those subconscious minds we have in Africa, conscious minds with readers, and end up benefiting from that cooperation. No way. The only way we can benefit is cooperating with ourselves. And I'll go to this. I forgot your name. I'm sorry. Abidou. Oh yeah. I'll go to your proposition that the only way we can solve this is through education. So I can tell you that the Africa president and citizens relationship is like a shepherd and sheep. They follow him because he has absolute power. In the US, I believe the president have limitations to their powers. They somehow really.
Wait until November.
Yeah. That's how the system is built. The system is built. The system of government is built that the presidents are going to have limited power. But in Africa, most of the systems are not like that. If the president believes that his ideas are correct, he's going to go through media, and you're all going to believe that. And majority of citizens believe through media. I'm telling you, Rwanda changed because of its struggle through media. Now Rwandans see themselves as one. So the president is capable of doing immense work than anywhere in the world. So now the education is going to start from the president because he is more than a professor to students, to the citizens. So the problem now is like, do we go through those protests, or is there any better way to convince the president to teach the people what they need to be taught? So the other thing is, I remember you talking about Tanzania, the way it was defunded. So what I'm proposing is a nation which can never be subjected to any kind of sanction. That's the United Africa. It's a nation which can never be subjected to any kind of punishment because it's the absolute need for them. They need it. Yeah, so if Africa has 1.5 billion people, how can you sanction that kind of? No way. If Africa is the biggest market in the world, how can you sanction the biggest market? No way. So we can do this through finding a way through whether we can follow the way that Corey the state, having people saying that we need this and needs to be done by the new president. So yeah, thank you. That's what we can think.
All right, thank you. Before we go to you, we'll start with Christabel. She had her hand up first, and then you can go.
I have a question. What does Africa want? Who told us what we want? Who told us we should want this? Because I'm just thinking, you know what? Somebody came and told us we need to be educated. Do we need it?
We're already educated.
Wait, no. Yeah, I mean, the way I'm defining the way education is defined. Somebody came and told us we need computers. Do we need them? I mean, now, because you're the computer generation, you can't imagine your life without computers. My first encounter with the computer, I was 21. And like, hey, my life was moving pretty smoothly without a computer. I was going to school, I was learning and stuff like that. Somebody came and told us we needed shoes. Do we need them? Somebody came and defined development for us. Why I'm asking this question is, do we as Africans know what we want as Africans without someone else's input? Because I think sometimes even some of the ideas that we are discussing, they are not based or centered on what we want as Africans, but on ideas that other people have impacted on us. So I think maybe if we can go back to that and answer that question, what do we want as Africans? Because the world is coming and told us we need stud roads. Did we really need them? I'm not saying we don't, but I'm just saying. Somebody came in and told us we needed cars. Did we really need them? Right? Somebody came in and said that if you do not have cars, stud roads, if you do not have cars, if you do not have buildings like this, then you're underdeveloped. For you to be developed, you need this. For you to do this, you need money. For you to be, did we need all those things? So can we answer what is it that we want as Africans? That we can say is African and not Asian inspired, European inspired, Middle Eastern inspired, or whatever. But this is Africa. This is what we want. I have an example that I can give. When we're looking at the poverty index, right? We are looking, and this is not an African defined thing. Like even GDP, it's not an African defined thing. It's somebody, some white old man sitting somewhere. Yeah, exactly, right? These are all terms. The things that we use to measure things in the world, none of them have been defined from an African perspective. They've been defined mostly from a Western perspective, right? So when we when we're defining the poverty index, for example, which is like less than $1 something per day, right? And I go to a rural area in Zimbabwe. Let's see, there's a place called Kitiatota in Karoe there, and it's in the middle of nowhere, in the back of beyond. Like the roads are like, yeah, right. I have never seen such joyful kids. They are running around without shoes, with their clothes. They're so unconcerned about all these other things. And somebody comes and like, oh, these children are living in poverty, but they're not worried because he knows at night when I go home, I'm gonna have my starter with milk. And I go to bed and I'm happy. In the morning, I wake up, I have my porridge and some fruit, and I'm happy. In the afternoon, I have this. And you get where I'm coming from. What is it that we want as Africans is defined by us, not is defined or measured by somebody else. Can we come to a consensus about that? Then maybe when we have a consensus about what we want and what we define for ourselves, we can then move on from there.
Okay, we'll wait, Israel. We'll go to Angela and then yeah.
So yeah, my question on comments, I wanted to kind of think what you would say and what you would say. That people talking about like people wonder kind of like your has been also with the students and like how much power we had to move beyond the genocide and kind of like create a new narrative in a new direction for Rwanda, which like everybody sees. And now today, what does turns out as an example of like people who can bounce back from a basic situation, which is like a perfect example. We have other African leaders that we came our side, and but how many do we have? That's the question. It goes back to what we're saying that the majority of the leaders that we have don't care much about the citizens, they care much about themselves. And the whole cabinet is pretty much similar. So how do we get to the point where our leaders, because as long as the leadership itself is cares about itself, it's very corrupt, doesn't really care. Like, because like when we go back to the history of Pan-Africanism, during those days when even it was transformed continental during the times of like Otarobi, Du Bois, and all those like during those days when it kind of like transcended beyond continent, those leaders, they really like were selfless. It was about the people. Like I think earlier on we said like, you know, decision making has to be based on like, does it help my people? Does it help my country or my continent? Those questions. Do we have leaders who get to ask themselves those questions to say, if it doesn't help my people? But unfortunately, that's not the reality. A majority of the leaders that we have, when they were looking at like local level, like council level, we were looking about like member of Congress or parliament or whatever you call the country, or like what you know, ministerial politicians or the president themselves. Nobody really cares about themselves. So as long as we have those leaders who don't care much about the people, then this whole dream of Pan-Africanism, it really pains me because I've written quite a lot about Pan-Africanism, looking at like back then in the days what it was, and like how we got lost along the way. Like when did we lose it? Like actually, like when did we lose it? It's just because we don't have those leaders who care. And how do we kind of like make it drastic or like a radical transformation for our leaders to bring them back to care about Africa or about even before even go to Africa, care about their own people. Because if they don't care about their own people, what if they care about their own people, they need support their innocent families or like their relatives. But not the country or like a constituency, they don't care. So if they don't even care about their own people, how much do they even care about Africa? So like within their inner circles, whether it's municipality, whether it's like constituency, whether it's kind of like a province or it's a country. So I think as long as we don't have those leaders, there's nowhere we are going. not only at intercontinental level, like no Pan-African level that we're talking about right here, but even at a local level. So maybe it's high time if we had leaders as like you, at least it can happen, but unfortunately, I've seen leaders, like I've been proximal to some people, like very proximal to me, who like when I feel like, what if we have somebody like this in leadership? And unfortunately, those people I've seen them get those leadership positions. What they do, they become like this. Exactly. like where did they get lost? So like as I see you right now, if I were to read 10 years down the line, and I really like one of you are presidents, I hope you're not going to go back to that future cycle. So this is the problem. And I don't know how we are going to kind of like correct that problem, kind of like unlock ourselves. We are so trapped in our leadership.
Okay, so we'll take one question.
Thank you. It's a comment and also an address to Isabel's question. The issue at us here is we are selfish, we are greedy, and to answer Isabel's question, what does Africa want? Africa wants and Africa needs a change in behavior and a better future for our children and our children's children. How do we suggest that we do that? By way of Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is an attitude. Pan-Africanism is a mindset. Pan-Africanism is a way of life. Pan-Africanism is a vision. We need to use the Pan-African vision to go back to our roots. Somebody mentioned earlier the collectivist background that we come from. If we go back to this, our own roots, laying the emphasis upon the collectiveness of us. I am because you are, and because you are, therefore we are. We can put the continent back into the right track. So to summarize myself, we need new visionaries or new leaders who are going to come back, take this vision and turn it into a reality of what we want, a better future for our children and our children's children.
Okay, thank you. So if anyone would like to go first, we'll start with Israel, then we can go to Korede.
I was just going to say almost everything. I just said thank you very much for that. And just to add a little bit to what Christabel. Christabel?
Yeah.
Christabel. So what does an African man want? So yes, we'll be talking about Pan-Africanism, integrating, coming together, stuff like that. But why should an African man care about, coming together of the whole of Africa? That's not the major problem that he has. And from what I can take away from this discussion, from this roundtable, is that Africa actually has one single problem. I mean, we have single enemy, which is poverty, right? As you said, Africa, Africa is a joyous continent. Always happy, always lively, always, going that way. But the problem of an African man comes when he's not able to provide for his family. And that is when, high blood pressure and depression and all these things come in. Let an African man be able to provide for his family, feed himself, provide for his family, they are healthy, and we don't even want to bother about what is going on with government. We don't even want to know who the president is. Yeah, I've heard about people saying, we are not even saying we should not steal our money, but do something. Yeah, well, and what that means is that, have mercy on us. You are only there taking all these things alone. Let us have a feel of what a proper society. I can tell you, an average African man may not care so much about roads, about electricity, he just wants to feed himself, And once that is done, every other thing, I just believe, because it's so fundamental. And if we are to go into comparative discuss now. We cannot compare the economy of UK with other, let's say, a country from Eastern Europe. I would not want to mention. You know, we have these disparities, we have this imbalance in the level of their economy, but they still come together and decide on things, and they have equal rights and stuff. So it is the same way that it will happen when an average African man, you know, can provide for his family, and you know, he can send his kids to school, and he's not bothered about, you know, what if I have diabetes? How will I have to save up for car? How to save up for, you know, all these things that. So, from my own point of view, when an African man is able to feed himself, at some point, I can even say it now, before Europeans come, before colonialism and slavery, it will be shameful for a grown-up man. Yes, I had this from my grandparents, that it will be shameful for a grown-up man to go to the market and purchase with money maize or yam, because these are produce that you are expected as a grown-up man, you know, in your 20s, to have, I mean, either from the farm or, you know, by one way or the other, you're supposed to have. So maize, all this food, all these things, you're supposed to have. So you feel ashamed to go to the market to buy them. But what has changed over time, that we now have to pay money, you know, use money to buy all of these things, is what we should address. And that is why we are not able to feed ourselves. So once that is done, I believe every other thing will sort itself. I mean, every other thing, then there is an adage in Yoruba that says, "See, everybody kúrò nínú iṣẹ́, iṣẹ́ bùṣe." What it means is that whatever it is that you are, whatever it is that you are thinking of, whatever problem that you have, once you're able to feed, every other problem is, you know, is just not as hard as actually. So it's just my little contribution.
Okay, thank you, Israel. Corday.
Thank you so much for the question you posed. What does Africa want? It's so striking and so very big for me to imagine what does Africa want. What came to my mind is we want everything everyone does. And also it seems like there are some things we want just for ourselves. You know, we want to be African in our own way. Maybe because I'm like a much younger generation. I want to what the West has, but I also want to be African. You know, but you said what the African wants is a better future for our children, and I think that is what is striking. But I think the better future for us lies with each person. What if we stop putting our faith in the leaders? Someone once said, "I elected you. You are not my leader. You are my servant." I think that is the outlook we need to take to change. You are my servant, you are not my leader. Maybe from there, we begin to make very important choices for ourselves. Or I am Yoruba, you are this tribe, it does not matter. What we want is a better future for ourselves. And we can only do that by choosing who we want to follow, who we want to follow. Quite unfortunate, things are not progressing and it doesn't look like things are going to improve. But I think there's also room for us to be happy. You know, now more than ever, people are conscious. I mean, I'm always happy to talk about the protests and how it was. You know, it was a beautiful thing for the first time because Gen Z would never protest, but they were shocked. So I think that's the start of the better future we have for ourselves. And also, when we look at the past, I think we somehow romanticize what Africa has been in the past. I mean, it was never rosy. There were wars before colonization. There was unrest. I mean, I'm sure there was poverty, sickness, disease, and death. But then things have gotten better. And I'm hoping things will also get better. So what does Africa want? It wants each and every one of us to do something about it.
Right. Okay, Timothy, then Joel.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about what Africa wants. There is something that is pervasive, not just in Africa, but the self-centeredness that is leading people to take decisions for everybody else. A typical example is the American context that we are in right now, the political situation we are in right now. I am not speaking for one party or the other, but sometimes I ask myself, how does it happen that you have all this evidence around, but people support one person in spite of a set of evidence over the other person? And the only answer you can have for yourself is they are looking at what they can get from that support. That is their focus. Is they don't care about whatever else anybody else would do or want. It's just them. And so that makes me want to believe that that desire to just want for yourself first is pervasive everywhere. And so in Africa too, you have that situation where there is something I call, I don't know if it has been mentioned anywhere else, but I call it show-off culture, where everybody wants to show off. People, even if they don't have, you know, to show. For instance, when you go to an accounting, like a funeral or something, when you go to a funeral, you will see that there is a lot of showing off. There is a lot of want to be beautiful, want to look good before everybody else. And so even if you don't have what it takes to show off, you still want to show off. And that leads to what? Corruption. Because now you don't have it, but you want to show off. So now you have to go and steal it, or you have to go and take from somebody else and make it your own to show off. I yield to the time.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we only have a minute left. So I don't know, Joe, if you can manage to.
Oh, yeah, I can answer one of the questions that I think are very important. I think she asked, like, what does Africa want? This is a question that I wish that she could ask it to the 54 president of the countries, people that they can look at each other and be like, are we working towards what Africa wants, or we are working towards what we want? So, in my view, what Africa wants is something that even the Europeans already have. We already wanted it before they even wanted it. Some people will tell you that when we were building the Ashanti Empire, the Europeans were living in caves, were dying of snow. So that shows you that Africa had already a vision of cities, had already a vision of big buildings, like those pyramids you have. But what they did is, like, when they got there, they were like, oh, we have to stop. We are the ones to get this first. So what we want is what we are seeing in the future. You want the rockets flying and catching them, as Elon Musk was in the last month, I believe. So that's what we want. But because we lack the proper implementation, we end up losing people who could do that, and they do it to other civilizations. So what we want is the universities, like this university we are in one of the African countries, that are able to have a hospital which can develop cancer projects, solve cancer, develop medicines, so that it can do such a thing. So that's what Africa wants. The problem is, how is Africa going to get it? It's through unity. That's my answer. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So it's exactly 2:45. Thank you so much to our panel here. May you give them a round of applause. And thank you so much to everyone for attending. If you want to continue this discussion, you can still approach the panelists here and continue the discussion. Thank you so much for attending.
I think after break, there'll be no session in here.
And thank you to the online people as well for.
Yeah.
Like from here, we're in.
Yeah.
Joe, you want to sit there? Oh, you want to hear?
Yeah, I was happy. Yeah, I need a picture for my profile.
Sit here, I'll get a photo of you guys when you do. That was exhibited, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I talked to a mom last year.
Oh, wait, you want this to be there?
No, I just need the profiles for my Instagram or whatever.
Yes, this thing is too hot.
I think if I go behind here, they will not see me. I'm so sure. Oh my God.
Do you want to read something? So you don't go behind. Pictures you drop your two cameras.
I never said that.
Oh.
Wicked.
That's so crazy. She doesn't.
Is that okay?
I want to snap a picture. Let me see.
No.
Yeah. You want me because they far and black.
That's this is black.
You say it was now? Yeah. Oh, black.
Papa, I snap.
Ah, that's very snap.
No, I did not set the settings of my camera sensing.
Like this?
Yeah.
Okay. I know they do. Oh, yeah, it's okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Guys, I don't get them. All of us, they had to be violent. It was like it's supposed to be like.
Let's go.
Israel. But yeah, I'm looking forward. Dressing up little kids.
Yes, sir.
Do you want to come and see? You guys can see.
How many people do you have?
I got a picture of you. Oh, I never. Oh, at least someone.
Yeah.
In action. She'll take the smiling shot. I'm gonna have you pretend that you're talking to each other. Oh,
Pretend?
no, smile for her.
You're very African.
Okay, now act like you're talking to each other. Okay, good. You're good.
Thank you. You don't snap.
Yes.
Yeah, the snapper now. How do we get it?
Okay.
For their Instagram thing.
Oh. Let's see.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great. It's so easy for you, right? Somebody died. Somebody abused. Came on the
There was never a time Nigeria didn't have young people.
No,
There was never. Our youngest leader was like 25. And he stayed in power like one. Yes.
Buhari was young. Buhari was young.
What?